My apologies. Good afternoon. My name is Mariama.
And my name is Mohammad Samara, and today we're going to present to you our project Agri-Educatum, التثقيف الزراعي, which is a project aiming to educate a new generation of agricultural hands-on learners. So when we first delved into our research into the agricultural sector of Morocco, we came across a very interesting quote by the Minister for Agriculture saying that if the agricultural industry is to be moved forward and driven forward in Morocco, there needs to be a new dependency on youth to carry the torch forward and to start driving this innovation. And this kind of got us thinking into how could we contextualize this into the current realities of Morocco. And we started looking into statistics that represented the youth of Morocco and paired that with agriculture. And what we found out is that recently, through the recent drop in Morocco's GDP due to the drop in the agriculture production, there has been an increase in the youth unemployment in Morocco. And then we were able to pair that up with the decrease in Morocco's staple food, which is their main product, which is wheat. And we decided to approach this from three main standpoints: an environmental standpoint, a policy-making standpoint, and an educational standpoint. From an environmental standpoint, the same amount of land has been planted for wheat production every single year, but the production has decreased by over 40% over the past 5 years, and that's mainly due to the irregularity of rainfall. When it comes to policy and policy making, it makes sense that since the production decreased, the importation has to increase. But what surprised us, however, was that the government had to impose strict taxes and tariffs on imported wheat, since the local population of Morocco prefers buying imported wheat over locally produced wheat, which presented us with a deeper level of a problem. And then from an educational standpoint, to simplify statistics down, out of every 10 Moroccan youth, 8 enroll in secondary school, only 6 graduate secondary school. And out of those 10, 4 end up working in the agricultural field. And that presented us with an opportunity of how could we possibly derive a project that could combine both agriculture and the education of the youth of Morocco in one.
And so by examining these pressing realities of the agricultural sector from these perspectives, we devised our thesis to consider an architectural answer. And so we led to our proposed thesis, being the development of a transferable architectural solution that joins the discourse of economic liberation in the MENA region through illuminating a generation of highly skilled agricultural hands and attuned critical thinkers that will lead the future of agricultural sector to major economic prosperity. So essentially, our proposed program will take this demographic of young, prospective learners and couple that with the fulfillment of the base consumptive needs of their education, i.e. wheat, and use education as a vehicle to carry forth and create a new generation of agricultural workers, highly adept and attuned policymakers, in addition to researchers and innovators that we would hope ultimately would lead to this ripple effect and shift the socio-political landscape for the people of Marrakesh and Morocco as a whole. And so we began by first examining the traditional means of agricultural education within the context of Morocco and Marrakesh, which was mainly informal family-based with no formal institutions dedicated to it beyond a vocational standpoint until 1995. And that led us to begin the process of designing and structuring our own curriculum that encompassed what we believed, and through our research, to be what would catalyze the change of this new generation of this demographic by encompassing multiple facets of this agricultural learning to create this holistic educational program that would service this need by connecting the students to the existing agricultural workers via a supervised learning program, in addition to laboratory studies, in addition to political literacy. And this curriculum stretches over a 5-year period with a 1-year foundations program, a 2-year specialization program with an interim 6-month internship program, which would act as kind of a bridge program that would allow students to get in contact and share the knowledge that they have began to cultivate with existing workers in the existing field. And then go on for another year and a half for a finalized specialization program. And that led to our architectural studies.
And since the program we're proposing and the curriculum we're proposing is something that we couldn't find any precedents for in the North African region, we started looking for inspirations from the product itself, which is wheat, and the physical manifestation of wheat, which is its means of storage. And those could be divided mainly into two components, either vessel storages, which are above ground, and underground storages. The vessel typology mainly depends on three main components, which is, firstly, it's divorced from the ground using rocks or wooden elements, and then it usually has a stereoatomic shell, and then a tectonic top that allows access into the shell. And then moving to the underground led us to a series of model explorations, trying to carry on lessons that we've learned from the previous models forward. And what that led us to was a group of models that we could divide into three main families. The one on the left mainly dealt with excavation and stereotomy. The one in the middle dealt with vessels and structures that are mainly divorced from the ground. And the last one dealt with the negative space that would be left over from the excavations that took place. And if we look at them closer, the excavation models become kind of self-explanatory. They become more solid, more rigid, more stereoatomic, while the vessel-like models start describing compartmentalization and dividing spaces. And lastly, the models that were derived from the negative space started alluding to more surface-like structures or more canopy-like structures. And those are some of the other models as well.
And so, gleaning from the lessons of our previous research and our model studies, we began to address the site. So this is the existing site, and we begin with a chronological distribution of our site functions across the site in the next slide. So because the program extends over 5 years, we decided to distribute the program chronologically across the site, with the first year existing in the bottom right corner, the second and third year existing in the upper left corner, and the fourth and fifth year existing in the upper right corner, with zones of intersection existing between all three of these, and extensions into a field. Then we have the distribution of these connection sites. So we then proceeded to adding this level of grain and detail to the arrangement of our program to address the demands and establish means of connection between these parts. And that led to our finalized master plan. Now, we arrived at our master plan by first examining and asking and questioning ourselves what it means to learn about agriculture. And this led us to devising a comprehensive index of learning spaces in accordance to the curriculum that we had designed and devised. And so that led to a system of categories and types. So we have 4 categories in accordance to our curriculum system: laboratory spaces, courtyard spaces, teaching spaces, and congregational learning spaces, with 3 types per category in order to address different scaled learning experiences. And to translate the index into 3D, we drew on the lessons from our previous model studies and attempted to devise a minimal surface for our roofing enclosure system, and to draw on that tectonic component from our previous study, and to interpret our compartmentalized vessel studies as well as our excavated strata studies via the 2 vernacular means of construction of mud brick construction as well as granite earth. And that led to the 3-dimensional manifestation of our catalog, of our index of learning spaces, and we'll just walk through a couple of them real quickly. So this is laboratory space A. It houses the research study of a small group of agricultural learners, and is meant to be a typology that facilitates focus study, and it's the base unit of this typology or this category of laboratories. The laboratory A has, when it comes down to the combination of these two, it has a variation where you could have it exist as two isolated elements, or it could have a roof condition where you could have a roof garden in addition to a mound that's created around it. Now, laboratory B is an amalgamation of it with the typology facilitating multiple groups of study and gathering them into one centralized typology and creating provisions for smaller groups of group work, but large collective group works in the midst of this research cultivation field. And that brings us to our courtyard learning spaces, which is a typology that's meant to accommodate outdoor learning. So contact with the learners can be immediate agricultural environment. So this typology for A accommodates small group of agricultural learners. B begins our investigation begins to draw on the research that we had derived from the grading studies with minimal excavation. And C houses the largest group of agricultural learners with the largest moment of excavation for a supervised experimental learning, and drops down about 3.5 meters. Then we move on to our teaching spaces. This typology for A houses a small group of learners for focused instruction. B has a semi-larger one, but it has a demonstration component to the end portion of it. And C also is meant for a large focus group kind of lecture style type instruction with provisions for a practical demonstration in the beginning and part of the typology. Now, congregational learning, these typologies are meant to house large groups of centered learning. So you have them at 3 grade scales, A, B, and C, depending on the capacity for and how large the gathering should be.
Moving forward from the index and realizing that the needs of the curriculum we proposed require a merger of those different learning spaces, and that to fulfill and satisfy the needs of the students and what they're supposed to learn, we started mixing together different sizes and proportions of the previous index parts, and we're going to walk you through 3 of the clusters we've developed. So in the first one, we can start seeing a bigger learning space being mixed with smaller laboratories around for more controlled learning environments, and then with, again, a form of a sunken courtyard to provide for more controlled learning spaces. And when we look at it third-dimensionally, for the clusters to not become isolated from each other. And as we've seen in the site plan, the cultivation fields become the connecting elements between the clusters themselves. And then within the clusters, we start having spaces where the clusters open up to the cultivation fields around them. So the students have all different learning experiences, so they could learn in bigger congregation spaces on the inside, smaller laboratory spaces, as we can see here. And then there is the research field on the outside where that provides them with learning directly from nature. And then we can start seeing moments where we start getting more niche courtyards around the labs to provide for even more controlled learning spaces. Moving forward to the second cluster, we start seeing the field disrupt the geometry further and intrude into the space further. So we start seeing openings here and here where the field starts leaking into the space itself, where we start blurring the boundary between learning in the field and in the cultivation research areas, and between learning on the inside and the bigger learning spaces, and then moving into smaller spaces which are more focused and more niche. And then 3-dimensionally, we can start seeing those moments where it leaks inwards. And then we can also start seeing moments where you start having thresholds between not only learning in a field and learning indoors, but also learning outdoors in a more controlled environment. And then that brings us back to part of the previous index where we start occupying the second level. And that's clear here where we can start occupying the insides of those labs, but also get on top of them and start having roof gardens that become even more focused research areas. And the third cluster focuses more on the larger learning spaces, because since what we're proposing requires policy making and other forms of formal education. We start having those formal education spaces, but still integrated within the site itself and within nature. So within the courtyard, how they open up to the courtyard. And then within the cultivation fields around them, we start having moments where that leaks into a courtyard and the learning experience is still continuous. And when one is walking from one cluster to the next or one class to the next, you're always immersed in the field and you're always in the same experience of passing through the field. And that led us to developing a cluster, a chunk of the site that contains more than one cluster together.
Yes, so in this extraction from the main site plan, we can see how the 3 clusters exist in response to the site. So essentially, each of these 3 clusters, they plug directly into these research cultivation fields, which are serviced by both the students as well as this technologically centered cultivation research program, which allows for with a circulation path existing in the midst of it, connecting these clusters to one another in the midst of these fields. And that encourages wandering as well as just dwelling within the field and existing within the agriculture. And from there also we have a response to the irregular rainfall with water catchments that plug into the on-site irrigation facilities that doubles not only to help for the cultivation research fields, but doubles as an opportunity to teach students about water management and conservation, and essentially allowing the wadi to contribute to this whole entire educational process. And here are the 3-dimensional versions of these 3. You can see how they interact and work with one another, the bridging over the wadi, in addition to how they come together to create this cyclic and feeding system, this loop between each of these clusters. And so we can take a few sections looking at how excavation and some separation from the ground can begin to exist within the program. So this is a section view, a close-up of cluster 1. You can see the wadi having some excavation, and then you see it kind of being mirrored in very subtle ways to create very niche courtyard conditions in this moment. And in the next section B, you can begin to see deeper excavations existing in the midst of the cultivation research fields, as you can see in courtyard C in the computational learning.
And as a closing statement to the project, our main intent behind it is to not only create a generation of highly skilled and developed agricultural learners, workers, and thinkers, but also to start bridging the gap between the existing agricultural community and the one we're trying to push forward, and to try and bridge together that disconnect between the older generations that have been practicing the ways they've been taught through their fathers and grandfathers, and the newer generations that should start adapting more towards a new technologically advanced methods of cultivation to start helping their economy and helping the agricultural sector move forward. And that's through both an architecture that doesn't seem too alien to the people of Morocco themselves, but an architecture that also starts providing opportunities of integration of technology and integration of advanced learning systems for both generations to start interacting together. And we can start seeing that happen through providing those spaces that give you the chance to learn in a field through the traditional ways that have already been practiced, but start introducing more technologically advanced systems while pairing them with more controlled spaces within those labs and within those learning environments to provide a holistic system that could start providing a new generation that could really start taking this generation and this agricultural sector of Morocco forward and into a brighter and more prospective future.
And so ultimately, our greatest ambition in this thesis and this project is to provide the start point to facilitate the advancement of the agricultural sector and grant this new generation to come, create this new generation that will help aid and abet its progress forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Camilo's mic is on, so jump. It's yours.
Okay. So
I love this project. I love the scale of this project. I love the tectonic of this project. I love the reality of this project. I was afraid at the beginning when they started playing with the circles that they were not going to arrive to campus. And when we look at the plan, the campus is still fragmented into 4 elements, but they're really united. And I really appreciate that. In the plan, yeah. I'm going to go in a different direction with my comments just because I really like this project. So I'm going to put that aside so that everybody can deconstruct that. And I'm going to ask you something. So none of your typologies are from Morocco. You have the impluvium from the Casamance. You have the town structure from the Maasai in Kenya. You have some Dogon stuff. So my question, and I'm being very facetious because Faisal is all about Orientalism. Are you making an African Disneyland in terms of your typologies? Or what? What is happening here?
Oh, wow. Oh, okay. So when it comes down to stemming it in the African reality to it, we looked at the continent as a precedence because we believed that Morocco is just as much African as it is Arab. And so both influences are worthy of exploration, worthy of consideration from an architectural standpoint, and worthy of integration within the program. And so we ended up just moving forward with a couple of those typologies. We noticed that some of them existed within the Arab world in addition to Northern Africa. So looking at some specific granaries that existed within the area across Syria as well as all the way up into the Maghreb. We saw that these forms from a planimetric standpoint did exist to a degree, but we just married a bunch of logics together to see what would make most sense for the achievement of this proposal.
And if I may,
I think it's very successful. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I think it's also pertinent to the conversation that was going on earlier when you were discussing it with Professor Faisal about what rammed earth is and what rammed earth could be, and he said that rammed earth existed as a construction material and will still exist. And the materials we're using are not alien to the context or the site. It's just we're trying to find ways that could serve our purpose better and use them in ways that could drive a more advanced direction or a different type of usage.
No, I agree. The materials you're using are totally Moroccan, but they're also Malaysian, they're also Senegalese, they're also Mauritanian. So that's very good. And I have absolutely no problem with the typologies. They are alien to Morocco, but that's not a problem either in that sense. And the use of round architecture is very sub-Saharan Africa, not so much Moroccan. Moroccan would be more like the Dogon in Cameroon. And they would be using typologically squares in that sense. But I love the combination. I love that you're leaving a lot of agricultural space. I like this project a lot. Congratulations.
Thank you.
By the way, a quick thing. All of those floating cities in the rocks look like an incredible science fiction project too. That representation system of the floating meteorite is very entertaining.
Can I just want to, because I agree with what Camille says. I can quibble and argue about the sort of formal conditions here, but there's no doubt about the thoughtfulness of this. And you did an extraordinarily thorough job. Your research is really pretty solid. And the material is this thing, as I look through this, the kind of the material and formal qualities of this thing are really quite beautiful in the landscape. But I want to go back to something, and this has opened up because of I think the very thoughtful nature of this project that you've been given, because there's this other component. You've been asked to do all this research on the economics of this, the sort of history of this. And I suspect you both did the research on the educational model, agricultural education. Have you looked at that? Yeah. Have you looked at the American model of agricultural education?
Yes, we looked at a couple of examples within the American example, as well as we explored some European examples as well to kind of compare and contrast the curriculums that were developed for these systems of education. We gleaned a lot from that when we were developing our curriculum.
The reason I bring this up is it's a really important cautionary tale, right? You should study it really carefully. So post-Civil War, the land-grant university system in the U.S. was started to educate people to do exactly what you're asking, what you're proposing here, right? To become educated, to improve productivity, to raise the farmer, right? The farmer up in society, to develop new technologies for agricultural activity and all of that. And it was extraordinarily successful. All the property, all the farms in the country were owned by families. It was the major employer in the United States for almost 100 years was agriculture. So it had the country wanted to professionalize agriculture to make it more economically viable, right? And it did. It was fantastically successful. But what it has led to, and this is the part that is the saddest of this whole tale, right? What it has led to is essentially the depopulation of farmers. The family farmers essentially disappeared. There's only a fragment of the population that's still involved, employed in agricultural activities. And the ones that still own their farms have been essentially turned into tenant farmers by the corporations that have bought up all the land and all that stuff, right? So because we created a class of agricultural technologists, right, who teamed up with economists and developed this kind of unstoppable machinery that consolidated agriculture into the hands of a few, right? So keep that in mind. So do you understand what I'm saying? This is when this came up, it brings to mind immediately, right? First, the optimism, incredible sort of importance of what you're trying to do here. But it's also something that leads under certain systems, right, to the destruction of the very thing it's trying to save, right? And that is a cultural problem, I think. Certainly in the United States it is. But it's something you should be aware of and think about carefully when you sort of go forward with this project and the theory behind it, right? Because that is something that you have to be aware of. That those people were not protected as they were in Europe, as they were in other parts of the world, right? The farmer has been basically made extinct in the United States. So.
Well, if I may, we do try to integrate that in the curriculum design by enforcing a 6-month internship period. In that internship period, we imagine for it to be kind of this bridge program where there will be this exchange of knowledge being cultivated by these young learners with actual members of the agricultural workforce, so that there can be this transparency, the optimism and the hope is for there to be this transference of knowledge between one subset of people and the other, so that at a point there can be a more equitable existence of this transference of this knowledge. I don't know if that might help.
Yeah, no, it will help. And I don't want to be too gloomy. I don't mean to be gloomy about this. It's just for me, it's a very important issue. It has been for a long time because we're the sort of part of and the people I grew up with. So it's a big deal. But here's what I do. The other part of this that I love, this project, right? And it's true for almost all of these projects, but in this one in particular, because you've actually an equally well-designed component of this project is the curriculum of the educational system, right? The design of that is also, it's very well done. It's very thoughtful. It's as an intensive design operation as the design of these facilities, right? And the idea that you would take that issue up in the design of the curriculum is a very important thing. So that's another critical element of this project that I think is really extraordinarily strong, and that's the seriousness with which you approach the design of the curriculum. What happens, not just the buildings, but what happens in them, right? What they're designed to support in terms of the structure of learning. It's a magnificent approach.
And I just wanted to mention something, a comment that I had in mind earlier that kind of somehow relates to some of the comments that were made. I was really struck towards the end by the last two renderings in your presentation, in which basically there's this idea that, like we're taking a particular form of agricultural production or culture of agricultural production and, and moving it towards something that's somehow maybe more ideal, whether that's in terms of ideas of efficiency or use of technology. And I was really struck by how that technology was being thought about or defined, like what was technology, and it was basically the robot and the drone. And I think this is kind of going back to some of these comments about these, like modernization projects and the impacts that they can have, and think against that. I'm not sure if you went to the Sharjah Architecture Triennial or if any of you are familiar with some of the projects there. One of the projects, Becoming Zerophile, is a really interesting kind of rethinking of what like agriculture, waterless agriculture could look like, which doesn't have that very typical kind of high tech take of things. So I just think maybe to think a little bit about about intergenerational knowledge, about local knowledge, about like historical technologies, and their place within this would also be kind of interesting, so that it's not just like a very specific view on things.
I'll just interject, and maybe to make a small conversation, and in response to Nadia's, and maybe then I'll leave the space for other people to speak. But I think that's you almost kind of are echoing an earlier critique that we had, which was at one point the project became masdar. And I know, Nadia, you probably have your own kind of critiques of that. But I think you almost kind of like, as though you were lurking in the shadows of the project, because those maybe are the remnants there, but at one point it was more explicitly masdar, even in terms of using the materials, right? So those cones were tents, which starts to talk about like a high-tech thing. So I think they've come a long way, at least in the imagery, to de-masdarify it. But I think you're kind of like hinting at not just the buildings, but the technology itself also being some form of like techno-optimist, like condition that's potentially problematic. But I think it's an interesting conversation.
And if I could just jump in also, like so Cooking Sections, which is the group that created this project at the Sharjah Architecture Triennial, they have a really interesting, they've done other iterations of this project in different places, including in Manifesta and Palermo in Italy, where they've thought about, like waterless watering using ancient techniques or local materials. And and within that, they have a really interesting article in eFlux, which is this online journal. And they talk about the relationship between power and access to power and water, access to water, and the distribution of power, and how within southern Italy this relates to the mafia. So to think about like who has access to these kinds of technologies, right? So their project, the project goes beyond just thinking of, expanding what a definition of technology means, but also when we think about technology in a very specific way, then that comes with who can access these expensive technologies, and like who's producing them and produces particular forms of social, economic, and political configurations. And I think their idea is like if we do waterless watering, then we can get away from that. And maybe if we think about technology more expansively, then we can also not just get it, like
I'm busy, I'll call you.
A result of an investigation of the sort of experience that one would have walking through these spaces, as opposed to sort of planting them into the context. And there's no right or wrong answer; it's just a decision that you make. But that's what I was saying. So for a while, I was sort of, wow, everything is so perfectly proportioned. The programming is there. You've sort of highlighted all the aspects that are required in a project of this nature to make it a successful one. But then I started to sort of really look at the access routes, and the staircases, and the steps down, and really imagining myself in these spaces. And your response could very well be, well, we want you to meander around and take the long way around. And then I noticed that at a certain point, the buildings really sort of gave their back to the field and the landscape. And again, it's just an observation, and maybe that was a conscious decision that was made. And that makes it successful in its own right. I would have liked to see a little bit more these sort of domestic or pedestrian level architecture. And what I mean by that is the junction between these two beautiful forms. And they are beautiful. I know as architects we're trained not to say things like that, but they really are sort of these sort of magnificent structures. And then when you started to present that to us, I was, I tried to limit myself from, or tried to limit the amount of times I really sort of discuss a rendering. But I was slightly disheartened to see interlock and basic hollow steel frame structures in the ceilings and in the roofs. And I was hoping that maybe the investigation would carry on even further and to sort of really sort of tie in these very, very minor loose ends that I feel go a long way. But in general, I mean, congratulations. It's a really beautiful project.
I mean, I think that's a fair critique, right? Like, they can tell you, there's two critiques here. There's one of imagery, but there's also one of really like an obsession with plan, right? But almost an obsession with the formal aspects of a plan. And I think, like Mariama, Samara, like, this is something that you... So, like, the comment I've written down was the plan, potentially, maybe, Tala, if I'm mistaken, but I wrote, like, the plan versus the experiential, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that maybe you guys, do you accept it? Is it something that you guys struggled with? Because we've been together for, like, 4 months now. And do you want to talk about it for a second? I just want... Because, like, I think they know. I think I appreciate that it's coming... I fully appreciate the critique, and I think it's accurate. And I don't know what they think about it now that we're done. Mariama, Samara, if you're too tired, it's fine.
I don't know. It's been a journey developing the index of spaces and trying to figure out what it means to learn about agriculture, what kind of space that requires, and trying to expand beyond the planimetric to three-dimensional. I think it was a challenge for the both of us. We were racking our brains trying to figure out how do we translate this spatial arrangement that would both melt somehow into the landscape and create this blurred connection between the agricultural field and the insulated enclosed space. So we did struggle with it, but we came upon these forms that drew on our earlier research, that drew on our previous art model studies, and we came to something that we think is very close to what the plan could be or suggest.
Okay, that's fair enough. I mean, while Saba and because we're late, I don't want to keep my critics further. So while Saba and Dania can share the screen, I think in general though, like just to pick up on Tariq's comment, maybe just something for everyone to take forward. And I think that's generally a critique for the studio is the extreme moving in scale from construction scale, from the scale of constructing the thing to the master plan scale. And I think what is missing, and I think he's highlighting it well, is that like putting the body in and walking around a little bit. And I think it's something that it's on me as well as it's on you. But it's something kind of to think about. Now you guys are graduating, for something to think about more immediately. Cool. All right. We have one more. Those critics who need to leave, I fully appreciate your time. Those who are willing to stay, Saba and Dania promised me a 10-minute maximum.